Hello and welcome. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. It's the 11th day of March 2022. It's 65 degrees and sunny here in Ventura, California. I am the OGGM, your guide to all the tabletop role-playing game news, weather, sports, and general internet nonsense. It's Friday the 11th, which means it's time to take a look at this week's tabletop role-playing game controversies and general nonsense that are cycling around. And of course, when I was studying broadcasting, yes, I know it's hard to believe, but I actually have a degree in broadcasting and communication. My broadcasting professor before told us one bit of news, one bit of information. He's like, forget everything else I ever say about broadcasting. When in doubt, if you have nothing else to talk about, you could always talk about the weather, because that's the one thing people can always talk about is the weather. Now, in relationship to our hobby, it seems that whenever we have nothing else to talk about, we can complain about some aspect of the system. And usually, for a lot of us, it's 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So once again, and we're circling around the whole 5e bad, 5e not D&D, 5e bad, what happened to 5e, Wizards of the Coast bad, Wizards of the Coast did this to me thing. And, a lot of people say 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons is not Dungeons & Dragons. It's blah, 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 blah. Because Dungeons & Dragons is blah, 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 blah. And Wizards of the Coast is blah, blah, blah. But really, you know what? Hasbro owns the name Dungeons & Dragons. They can call whatever they want Dungeons & Dragons. So if they want to call the 5th edition, which technically isn't the 5th edition, by the way, it's like the 12th, Dungeons & Dragons, sure, they can. If they want to call my soda Dungeons & Dragons, sure, they can. If they want to call my cat D&D, they can. They can call whatever they want Dungeons & Dragons. It's their word. They own it. So really, yes, it is D&D. But is 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in the way we picture D&D in our head? As in, when you say Dungeons & Dragons, it has a certain universal image that pops in your head, which is sort of a combination of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, King Arthur fantasized England, and old school late 70s, early 80s adventure movies like, The Sword and the Sorcerer, Lady Hawk, stuff like that. There's a certain image, a certain style of play that the word Dungeons & Dragons sort of evokes. 5th edition is not D&D because the system is so different to what we're used to, and the style of play is so different. It's much more high power. It's much more over the top, that it really isn't D&D, and that it doesn't evoke that imagery. Now, 0 edition, 1st edition, 2nd edition, and even 3rd edition are more or less D&D. They have a certain emotional and visual and intellectual idea that is sort of associated with them, a style of play. And if we're going to compare that style of play to stuff we know, I would compare 0 edition, 1st edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 3.5 to Excalibur, Conan, Lady Hawk, The Princess's Bride, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, stuff like that. A certain style of play, a certain imagery, a certain level of magic, a certain level of adventure, a certain level of just, this is the way the world works. Then we get 4th edition, and 4th edition definitely is not Dungeons & Dragons. It is a completely separate game. In fact, I will go to my grave saying that had they just called 4th edition Eberron the role-playing game, they would not have any of these problems. It's really, in the perfect D&D timeline, that's what they should have done. This is the Eberron role-playing game, and they should have used the system that we associate with 4th edition. And then for about a year, it's the Eberron role-playing game. And at the end of that year, what they should have done is they should have said, all right, what do you think of this system? Should we use it to be the next Dungeons & Dragons? Should this be D&D 4th edition? And if people said yes, then they could have released the 4th edition Player's Handbook and said, now here are the rules to do other worlds besides Eberron. Or they could have just kept Eberron as the core rule for 4th edition. And if people unanimously said no, then they could have been like, okay, we're gonna, we've got this Eberron license, so we're gonna continue to support it because it's not the first time they've made games that aren't D&D. Look at Alternity and, stuff like that. And then they could have done something else. They could have given us, I don't know, what we see now as 5th or something similar to Pathfinder. If you think that Pathfinder 1st edition is the logical successor to 3.5, then they could have done that with 4th edition. But really, I think had they released 4th edition as Eberron the role-playing game and not done any of the other stupid things, and there's so many stupid things they did with 4th that's this whole separate vlog, they probably could have avoided all the things. But 4th edition is not D&D. Then we get 5th edition. We get 5th edition before Tasha's, and we got 5th editions after Tasha's. 5th editions before Tasha's feels a lot like D&D, but when you really get into the system, it's not. It's close. It's D&D adjacent. It's a much more high-power, heroic fantasy D&D. And if I were to compare it to a movie or a TV show, I would compare 5th edition before Tasha's to Hawk the Slayer or He-Man. Way more over the top, way more heroic, but it's not D&D. That's not to say that the 5th edition engine is not bad, and we'll get to that in a second, but it's not D&D. And then we have 5th edition after Tasha's, which again is a completely different game between 5th edition and 5th edition after Tasha's. I mean, it is drastically different. And I would say definitely now, post Tasha's 5th edition D&D is not D&D, other than the fact that Wizards of the Coast, of course, can call it D&D because they can call whatever they want D&D. But 5th edition is not D&D. 5th edition post Tasha's is definitely not D&D. And if I was going to compare it to, stuff, I would compare 5th edition post Tasha's to, Thunder the Barbarian, Ralph Bashki's Wizards, Heavy Metal, Black Star, a lot of the late, early Power Rangers. It's just completely over the top. It's weird. It's wonky. It's got all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, there's coffee shops now. There's coffee shops. That's not D&D. Unless, of course, we're doing Expedition of the Barrier Peaks where there's a craft spaceship and the craft spaceship could have a coffee shop. But there's coffee shops now. Strixhaven is not D&D. Okay, it's a completely separate world, and going forward, I'm going to assume that whatever they make next, even if it is Dragonlance, is not going to be D&D the way we see D&D. And that's fine, okay? That's fine. It's not D&D, who the fuck cares? There's plenty of retro clones and plenty of ways to play D&D whatever way you want it. Wizards of the Coast can call 5th edition, 6th edition, whatever they want. They can call it Dungeons & Dragons. They can call it Adventures in the Multiverse. They own the name. They can call it whatever they want. Now, the 5th edition engine is fine. There's a lot of stuff I like. I like advantage and disadvantage. I like the proficiency modifier. I like expertise. I like most of the classes, so a lot of them got nerfed. I like the new rules for how proficiency works as compared to number of times per day. I like that rule. It's not D&D. It doesn't evoke the idea of D&D. It evokes a different style of play, a different style of imagery. It'd be perfect for like a pulp action, Indiana Jones, Hercules and Xena, Thunder the Barbarian style of play, but it's not Excalibur. It's not Lady Hawk. It's not Lord of the Rings. It's not D&D. And that's okay. That's okay. It's 2022, and 5th edition came out, 2014, 2015? So it's been 8 years. It's 8 years going on. If you're still talking about the fact that you don't think 5th edition is Dungeons & Dragons and you're still upset about it, let it go, okay? Let it go. Now, if you want to be upset about the stuff people have said about older players, and we're going to be addressing that in a separate vlog, or the racism or the sexism or all the other things or all the other bullshit that the Twitter crowd has been saying about us, that's fine. And if you want to be upset at Wizards of the Coast because of their political choices, that's fine. That's your prerogative. Who cares? I'm here to talk about game systems. I'm not here to talk about politics. I've said it before. If you want me to talk politics, I will make a separate channel where I talk about politics. Right now, I'm going to eat some of this Dungeons & Dragons because Wizards of the Coast can call my sandwich Dungeons & Dragons if they want. If that's something that upsets you, fine. Talk about that. But if Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the system upsets you, let it go. It's not D&D other than a name, and that's fine, okay? The engine is great. A lot of the stuff before Tasha's is great. There's even some good ideas and stuff post Tasha's if you just, cut through the crap that Wizards of the Coast has piled on. Which, could have been great. On paper, it's a great idea. Wizards of the Coast ruined it. Strixhaven could have been great. On paper, it's a great idea. Wizards of the Coast ruined it. Ravenloft could have been great. Could have been great. One of the best adventure modules ever written. Ravenloft, Wizards of the Coast ruined it. Okay, fine. Whatever. We're not the target audience anymore. I don't know who the target audience is. It's definitely not 5e players, because 5e players are abandoning 5e in droves. I mean, take a look. What was the number 2 selling role-playing game this time, as of January? Pathfinder. D&D was number 1, but Pathfinder is number 2. Now, the amount of 5e players that would have had to jump ship over to Pathfinder to raise Pathfinder back to number 2 from where it was in the list this time a year ago, that's huge. That's way over 50%. That's like 55 to 60% of 5e players jumped ship and started buying Pathfinder in order for Pathfinder, because Pathfinder this time last year was number 5. And now it's number 2 in sales. That's huge. That's huge. And remember, Pathfinder once kicked D&D to the curb and was king of the hill for 3 or 4 years until 5th edition came out. But everybody and their dog had abandoned D&D and started playing Pathfinder. They went back to D&D in 5th and now are abandoning 5th for the OSR. But a lot of 5e players are like, fuck this, Wizards of the Coast. I don't know what you're doing with my game, but it's not D&D. I'm going to go play this other game. So even 5e players don't think 5e is D&D anymore. So really, why do you feel the need to keep making videos going, 5e is not D&D? You're right. It's not. And who cares? Really, it's not a thing. I understand you're upset about the politics and the choices. Fine. But the engine, 5e, the engine is perfectly fine. It's perfectly enjoyable. It would work great for a bunch of other games, including a Thunder Barbarian style of fantasy game. But it's not D&D, and that's okay. Now let's move on to more important topics. The stuff we're really upset about. The stuff people are saying about us. The accusations. Those are things we could address. But those have nothing to do with 5th edition. That has just to do with the culture war and the civil war that is embracing our hobby. And that's definitely things we could talk about that has absolutely nothing to do with 5e engine. Because 5e engine works great, just not for D&D style of play. But if I was running Thunder the Barbarian or Heavy Metal or Ralph Bashki's Wizards, He-Man, Power Rangers, fuck yeah, I'd use 5e. It's perfect for those. Anyways, if you agree with me, let me know. If you think I should shut up, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe by August 4th and we'll do something crazy. Till then, I am the OG GM, addressing all the controversy or lack thereof that is hitting our hobby. See ya.